man traveling with a relief picture. Ranpo Edogawa. If this story was not a dream of mine, or merely a fleeting hallucination, then surely the man traveling with the decorated screen was, without a doubt, the mad one. But just as a dream sometimes grants a fleeting glimpse into a world that diverges from ours, or as a madman sees and hears things beyond our perception, perhaps I, too, had momentarily glimpsed an isolated corner of another world, just beyond our visible reality, through some strange atmospheric lens. It was on a warm, slightly overcast day of unknown date. At that time, I was returning from Wozu, where I had specifically gone to see the mirage. When I recount this story, friends occasionally challenge me, saying, "But you've never actually been to Wozu, have you?" And, to be honest, I cannot provide a concrete date or proof that I visited Wozu. Could it have truly been just a dream? Yet I have never before dreamt of scenes so vividly saturated with color. While dreamscapes, like scenes from a film, typically lack any hint of color, that train scene, with that garishly painted screen at its center, vivid in purple and vermilion, remains burned in my memory as vibrantly as a serpent's piercing eyes. Could there truly be such a thing as a colored dream? At that time, I saw a mirage for the first time in my life. I had imagined it as something like an old-fashioned painting of a beautiful undersea palace floating in the breath of a clam. Yet the sight of the real mirage struck me with a near terror, a shock so intense it brought forth a slick sheen of cold sweat. A crowd of tiny figures, like scattered beans, had gathered in the pine groves along Wozu's beach, watching the vast sky and sea in silent awe. I had never before seen such a tranquil sea, one so utterly silent, almost as if it were mute. I had always assumed the Sea of Japan to be wild and turbulent, so its calmness surprised me. The sea was gray, entirely still, stretching infinitely, appearing more like a vast pond than an ocean. But unlike the Pacific Ocean, this sea lacked a horizon, with the sea and sky blending seamlessly in a single, foggy gray, concealed in thick haze. What I had assumed was simply the sky's haze was, in fact, the sea's surface, where large, ghostly white sails floated by, drifting like specters. The mirage was as if someone had dropped ink onto a milky film, watching it spread slowly and naturally, like a gigantic projection cast onto the sky. Through a warped atmospheric lens, a distant forest from the Noto Peninsula appeared right before us, awkwardly enlarged, like an unfocused insect under a microscope, looming absurdly above. It resembled an oddly shaped black cloud, yet unlike a regular cloud, whose distance is always clear, the mirage was curiously ambiguous in its proximity. At times it seemed like a giant spirit drifting far out on the sea. At others it appeared as if it hovered directly in front of me, an eerie, monstrous fog, or even a single dark spot floating on the surface of my cornea. This ambiguity of distance gave the mirage an eerie, unsettlingly mad quality. A massive, pitch-black triangular shape would rise, stacking upon itself like a tower, only to collapse in an instant, stretch sideways, rush forward like a lengthy train, break into several pieces, stand like a row of cypress treetops, and silently transform into entirely different shapes. If the allure of the mirage had the power to drive one mad, I must have been unable to escape its pull at least until I boarded the train for my journey home. After standing transfixed for over 2 hours, gazing at the mysterious phenomenon in the sky, I left Wozu that evening. Yet until I spent the night on the train, I remained in a state utterly different from my usual self. Perhaps, like a passing spirit that fleetingly disrupts a person's mind, I had fallen under a temporary spell of madness. I boarded the train bound for Ueno from Wozu Station around 6 in the evening. Perhaps it was a strange coincidence. Or maybe trains around those parts were always this way. But the second-class car I entered was as empty as a church. Other than myself, there was only one other passenger, huddled in a corner of the seat cushions across from me. The train rumbled along the lonely coastline, with steep cliffs and sandy beaches passing by, accompanied by the monotonous clatter of the machinery. Somewhere deep in the hazy gray sea, I could faintly sense the dark color of a sunset resembling blackened blood. Large white sails, strangely magnified, drifted across this scene like apparitions in a dream. It was a stifling day without a single breath of wind, and the occasional breeze slipping in through the open train windows was as faint and fragmented as a ghost. Numerous short tunnels and rows of snow shelter pillars marked stripes across the vast gray sky and sea as they passed by. As we approached the cliffs of Oyashirazu, the encroaching twilight made the brightness of the train's lamps and the light from outside seem almost equal. Just then, the only other passenger rose suddenly, spread a large black satin furoshiki cloth over his seat cushion, and began wrapping up a flat object, around 2 by 3 feet, that had been propped against the window. There was something strange about this that caught my attention. This flat item was likely a framed piece, yet he had positioned its face toward the window, as if that were particularly meaningful. It seemed as though he had purposely unwrapped it just to set it up in that manner, facing outward. And when he wrapped it up again, I caught a glimpse of the vivid colors on the surface of the frame, so strangely lifelike that it seemed almost otherworldly. I took the opportunity to examine this peculiar passenger more closely, and was even more surprised to find that he was far more unusual than his odd baggage. He wore an extremely old-fashioned black suit, the type you might only see in faded photographs from our father's youth, with a narrow collar and sloping shoulders. Yet on his tall, long-legged frame, it seemed strangely fitting, even stylish. His face was thin and well-formed, though his eyes glistened a bit too intensely, giving him an almost sharp look, with his neatly parted hair, rich and black, gleaming with a healthy shine. At first glance, he appeared around 40, but on closer inspection, his face was marked by deep, numerous wrinkles that made him look as though he could easily be in his 60s. The striking contrast between his dark hair and his pale, deeply lined face was so unsettling that it startled me when I first noticed it. After he carefully finished wrapping his package, he glanced over at me, just as I was watching his movements intently, and our gazes met squarely. He gave me a slight, embarrassed smile, curling one corner of his mouth, and I found myself nodding back almost reflexively. For the next couple of stations, we both sat in our respective corners, exchanging glances now and then, only to look away awkwardly. By now, it was pitch dark outside. Pressing my face against the window, I could see nothing save the occasional distant glow of fishing boats' lanterns far out at sea. In that endless darkness, our narrow train car felt as though it were the only world left, moving on and on with its steady clatter. Within the dimly lit car, it was as if the entire world, all living beings, had disappeared without a trace, leaving only the 2 of us behind. In our second-class car, not a single passenger boarded at any station, nor did we see the train attendant or conductor even once. Reflecting on this now, it strikes me as exceedingly strange. I was growing more and more afraid of this man, whose appearance resembled that of an old Western magician and who could have been either 40 or 60 years old. Fear, when undistracted by other matters, has a way of expanding infinitely, filling one's entire being. Finally, my fear had spread to the very tips of the fine hairs on my body, and unable to bear it any longer. I suddenly stood up and walked briskly over to where he was seated in the corner. It was precisely because I found him repellent and terrifying that I approached him. I quietly lowered myself onto the seat across from him, and in an almost surreal state of mind, as if I were some sort of phantom myself, I narrowed my eyes and stared intently at his pale, deeply wrinkled face, which looked even stranger up close. From the moment I left my seat, he had been watching me, and as soon as I leaned in to study his face, he seemed to have been expecting me, pointing with his chin toward that flat package next to him. Without any introduction, and as though it were a perfectly natural greeting, he said, "Is it this?" His tone was so casual that it startled me. "This is what you wish to see, isn't it?" When I remained silent, he repeated the same words. "Would you show it to me?" Drawn into his rhythm, I ended up saying something strange. I hadn't risen from my seat with any particular desire to see his package. "I would be delighted to show you. I've been thinking for some time now that you would surely come over to take a look at this." The man, though it would be more appropriate to call him old man, said this while deftly untying the large cloth wrapping the frame-like object with his long fingers. This time, he positioned it with the front side facing me, propping it up against the window. I caught a brief glimpse of its surface and instinctively closed my eyes. I still don't know why, but somehow I felt I had to close them, and so I kept them shut for a few seconds. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself confronted with a most peculiar sight, the likes of which I had never seen before. And yet, I lacked the words to clearly explain exactly what made it peculiar. The frame depicted a scene resembling the backdrop of a kabuki play palace, with multiple rooms extending far into the distance in extreme perspective, creating an illusion of blue tatami mats and latticework ceilings stretching far away, painted with a garish indigo-heavy tempera. In the foreground to the left, there was a thick black brushstroke of a shoin-style window, and next to it, a writing desk painted in the same dark color, set at an awkward angle. If I had to describe the style of the background, it was somewhat reminiscent of those unique votive plaques seen in Japanese shrines. Within this background, two figures, about a foot in height, stood out in relief. They appeared to stand out because they were crafted as raised fabric cutouts. An elderly man with silver hair, dressed in an antiquated Western-style suit of black velvet, sat uncomfortably, and strangely enough, his features, save for the color of his hair, matched the elderly man before me exactly, even down to the tailoring of his suit. Beside him, a beautiful young girl, perhaps 17 or 18, wearing a bright scarlet furi sleeve kimono with a black satin obi and adorned with a soft, loosely tied bow, was draped across the old man's lap with a certain innocent coquettishness. It was, in essence, a tableau reminiscent of a romantic scene from the theater. The contrast between the elderly man in Western clothes and the alluring young woman was certainly striking. But that was not the source of the peculiar feeling I experienced. The craftsmanship of the raised fabric figures was astonishing, especially in contrast to the rough background. The face, made of white silk, had contours that showed even the finest wrinkles, while the girl's hair was crafted from real strands, each one carefully inserted and arranged as if styled like human hair. The old man's head, too, was surely fitted with genuine white hairs planted with painstaking care. The suit displayed real stitching, with tiny buttons like millet grains placed precisely in the right spots. The girl's figure featured the gentle curve of her chest, the graceful line of her thigh, and the vibrant folds of her crimson crepe, with a glimpse of bare skin and shell-like fingernails on her fingers. One might think that, If viewed through a magnifying glass, even pores and fine hair would be visible. Until then, my experience with raised fabric pictures had been limited to the crafted faces of actors on battledores, which, although intricate, did not compare in the slightest to the exquisite skill and detail evident here. This must have been crafted by a master of the trade. Yet, this wasn't what I found peculiar. The frame itself appeared quite old, with the tempera paint background flaking in places. The girl's vibrant red kimono and the old man's velvet suit were faded, almost unrecognizable, yet even with the wear, there remained an indescribable vividness that seemed to scorch itself into the viewer's memory with an eerie vitality. Still, this was not the source of my peculiar feeling. What was peculiar, if I may forcefully say it, was that the two figures within the raised picture were alive. In Bunraku Puppet Theater, there are rare, fleeting moments, once or twice in a performance, when the puppet in the hands of a true master seems to receive a breath of life from the divine and, for just an instant, truly lives. These figures felt as though they had been frozen in that precise, life-infused instant, captured and pinned forever onto the board, eternally living yet never escaping. Perhaps noticing the astonishment on my face, the old man exclaimed in an almost hopeful tone, "Ah, you might understand." As he said this, he carefully unlocked a black leather case hanging from his shoulder and took out an incredibly old-fashioned pair of binoculars, offering them to me. "Here, please, take a look through this." "No, from there, or too close." "My apologies, but please move back a few steps." "Yes, just about there will do." It was a strange request, yet I was completely captivated by curiosity and did as he asked, stepping back 5 or 6 paces from the frame. The old man held the frame carefully, angling it towards the light so I could see it clearly. Looking back, it must have been a truly bizarre, almost mad scene. The binoculars, most likely an imported item from 20 or 30 years prior, were an odd-shaped prism binocular, the kind we used to see as children on opticians' signs. They were well worn, with the black leather peeling off in places to reveal brass underneath, giving them an antique charm much like the old man's suit. I spent a moment examining them curiously before finally bringing them up to my eyes. Just then, abruptly, out of nowhere, the old man let out a cry, a scream so close to a shriek that I nearly dropped the binoculars in surprise. "No, no. You mustn't look at it upside down." The old man, his face drained of color, eyes wide and round, waved his hands frantically. I couldn't understand why looking through the binoculars upside down would be so terrible, but the old man's strange behavior was baffling. "Oh, I see. Upside down, was it?" Absorbed in peering through the binoculars, I paid little mind to his distressed expression. I adjusted the binoculars to the correct orientation, then quickly raised them to my eyes and gazed at the figures within the frame. As the focus sharpened, the two circular fields of vision gradually merged, and a faint rainbow-like effect grew clearer. Soon, the upper body of the girl appeared, expanding until it seemed to fill my entire field of view, as if it were the entire world. I've never experienced anything quite like it, and it's hard to describe, but the closest comparison might be to catching a glimpse of a diver emerging from the depths while watching from a boat. As a diver's bare form swims beneath the surface, their body twists unnaturally through the shifting layers of blue water, blurring like seaweed and taking on a ghostly pallor. But as they near the surface, the blue thins, the figure becomes clearer. And when their head finally breaks the surface, the sight shocks the viewer awake. In the same way, The girl in the frame appeared before me through the binoculars, coming to life as a real, life-sized girl, moving within the confines of the frame. Through the ancient prism binoculars from the 19th century, I was peering into an entirely different world. A world where this adorned girl with her elaborate hairstyle and the old man in his antique Western suit led an eerie, surreal existence. I felt as though I was being made to witness something forbidden, as if the sorcerer himself were forcing me to spy into a world I should not see, yet captivated. I continued to peer into that strange world. Although the girl wasn't actually moving, the impression of her was completely transformed, brimming with life. Her pale face had a faint flush. Her chest seemed to pulse. I could almost hear the beat of her heart. And I felt the vibrant, youthful warmth of her body radiating through the layers of crimson crepe fabric. After scanning her entire figure with the binoculars, I shifted my gaze to the fortunate elderly man with whom she leaned. In the lens's world, he too seemed alive, his arm around the young girl's shoulders in a pose of bliss. Yet, strangely enough, his face, enlarged to fill the lens, revealed an expression of puzzling torment hidden deep within the hundreds of wrinkles. Perhaps it was the distortion of his face, brought unsettlingly close by the lens, but the longer I stared, the more unsettling it became. A mixture of pain and horror that sent a chill through me. Seeing this expression, I felt as though I were trapped in a nightmare, unable to bear looking any longer. I tore my eyes away from the binoculars, glancing around the carriage in disoriented panic. I was, after all, still in the lonely night train. The framed picture, the old man holding it. Everything remained as it was, with the inky darkness outside the window and the monotonous clatter of the wheels echoing unchanged. I felt as though I had just awoken from a horrible dream. "You have a rather peculiar look on your face," the old man remarked. He placed the frame back by the window and sat down, motioning for me to take a seat across from him. He gazed intently at my face as he spoke. "It feels as though my head isn't quite right. Isn't it unusually humid?" I replied, half embarrassed, with a casual remark. The old man then leaned forward, his hunched form drawing closer, his thin fingers twitching slightly as if signaling something on his lap. He spoke in a very low, almost whispering voice. "They were alive, weren't they?" he said. His words sounded as though he were revealing a grand secret, and he leaned in even closer, his rounded eyes gleaming as he looked at me as though he were about to bore a hole through my face. "Would you like to hear the true story behind those figures?" he whispered. The low murmur of his voice, mingling with the train's gentle rocking and the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, made me wonder if I had misheard him. "Did you say their story?" I asked. "Indeed. Their story?" he replied, still in that hushed tone. "Especially the story of the old man with the white hair. From his younger days, you mean?" For some reason, that evening, I, too, found myself speaking in a strangely detached way. "Yes, the story from when he was 25. I would very much like to hear it." I urged him on, as if asking for an ordinary life story from an ordinary person, though I was aware this was anything but ordinary. The old man's wrinkled face twisted into a look of sheer delight. "Ah, so you will listen after all," he said, and he began to recount an extraordinary tale. "It was the most significant event of my life, so I remember it well. It happened on the evening of April 27th, 1895, when my brother became as he is now," he said, pointing to the elderly figure in the framed artwork. Back then, my brother and I were still living at home in the Nihonbashi area, where our father ran a kimono business. The 12-story Ritonkaku in Asakusa had just been completed, and my brother would go up there almost daily, thrilled by the novelty. He was quite fond of foreign things and always interested in the latest gadgets. That's how he acquired these binoculars, you see. He came across them in a strange little shop in Yokohama's Chinatown, where they were being sold as an item previously owned by a foreign ship captain. He paid a good sum for them at the time. Each time he referred to my brother, he cast a glance or pointed towards the white-haired figure in the frame, as though his real brother were sitting right there, listening to the story. It was as if he were confusing his memory of his actual brother with the elderly figure in the artwork, speaking as though this third presence were right beside us. Strangely, this didn't strike me as odd in the least. In that moment, it felt as though we were residing in a world slightly misaligned with the laws of nature, a world separate from ours. Have you ever been up the 12-story tower? Oh, you haven't? What a shame. That structure was like something conjured by a magician. A truly remarkable, bizarre creation. The official story was that it was designed by an Italian engineer named Barton. But consider this. At that time, Asakusa Park's attractions included a Spider-Man show, sword dancing by young women, ball balancing acts, Genmizu's top spinning performance, and various peep shows. The most unique sights were a miniature replica of Mount Fuji and a labyrinth featuring the famous Hatijin Sugi display. Then, suddenly, this absurdly tall brick tower sprang up, astonishing everyone. It was 46 ken tall, a little over half a block, with an octagonal top that pointed up like a Chinese hat. And from any elevated spot in Tokyo, you could see its red, ghostly outline towering over the city. As I was saying, it was the spring of 1895, shortly after my brother acquired these binoculars. That was when strange things began happening to him. Our father was so worried that he wondered if my brother had lost his mind. And as you might imagine, I was beside myself with concern. I was incredibly devoted to my brother, you see, so his bizarre behavior troubled me deeply. Let me tell you what he was like during that time. He hardly ate, barely spoke to anyone at home, and spent most of his time locked in a room, lost in thought. His body grew thin, his face turned a sickly, ashen hue like someone with tuberculosis, and his eyes had an unsettling, wild gleam. Not that he ever had a healthy complexion, mind you, but he looked paler and more withdrawn than usual. So it was truly heartbreaking to see him like that. And despite all this, he would still leave the house daily, like he was going off to work, wandering off somewhere every afternoon and returning by dusk. Whenever we asked where he'd been, he wouldn't say a word. My mother, we asked where he'd been, terribly worried, tried every approach to get him to explain the cause of his gloom, but he refused to open up. This went on for about a month. Finally, our concern reached a breaking point. So one day, I decided to secretly follow him to see where he was going. It was actually my mother who urged me to do it. So, on a day just as dreary and overcast as today, my brother set out shortly after noon, wearing the very dashing black velvet suit he'd had made, a cutting-edge outfit for that time, and with these binoculars hanging from his shoulder, he ambled off toward the horse-drawn tram stop in Nihonbashi. I kept my distance, careful not to let him notice I was trailing him. Are you following so far? Well, as it happened, he boarded the tram heading toward Ueno. Unlike the electric trams of today, I couldn't just catch the next one and follow him, as there were far fewer trams back then. So, with no other choice, I splurged some of my pocket money, given to me by my mother, and hired a rickshaw. Luckily, a strong rickshaw puller had no trouble keeping up with the tram. When my brother got off the tram, I hopped out of the rickshaw and followed him on foot once again. Eventually, we arrived at none other than the Kannon Temple in Asakusa. My brother passed through the Nakamai's shops, walked past the main hall without stopping, and then wove his way through the crowds in the entertainment area behind the temple until he reached the front of the 12-story tower I mentioned earlier. He went through the stone gate, paid the fee, and disappeared into the entrance marked Rutunkaku, entering the tower. I was absolutely stunned. I never would have guessed that my brother had been coming here every single day. As a young boy, not yet even 20 at the time, I couldn't help but think that perhaps he had fallen under the spell of this 12-story monster, that he was somehow enchanted by it. It was a strange notion, I know, but that's what crossed my mind back then. As I mentioned, I had only been up the 12-story tower once when my father took me, and I hadn't returned since. The place had a bit of an eerie feel to it, but since my brother was climbing it, I had no choice but to follow him, keeping about one floor behind. The narrow stone stairs were dim and damp, like some underground cellar, with only small windows and thick brick walls. Back then, during the Sino-Japanese War, the walls were lined with oil paintings of battle scenes, which were rare and highly valued at the time. These paintings depicted Japanese soldiers with fierce, wolf-like expressions, charging forward while screaming, Chinese soldiers clutching their sides, blood spurting from wounds made by bayonets, their faces and lips contorted in purples of agony, and severed queues flying up into the air like balloons. These grotesque, bloody images gleamed faintly in the dim light seeping through the windows. Meanwhile, the staircase wound upward like a snail shell, endlessly spiraling to the top. The whole experience felt distinctly surreal. When you finally reach the top, it's a parapet with no walls, an observation deck with only the railing around it. It suddenly becomes bright as day, and the shock of emerging from the dark, twisting stairwell makes the view even more startling. Clouds seem almost within reach, and as you look out, all of Tokyo's rooftops are scattered below like bits of debris, while the Shinagawa fortifications look like tiny garden stones. I forced myself to look down, despite the dizziness. Even the main hall of Kannon Temple was far below, with the fairground stalls looking like toys, and the people walking about were barely more than heads and feet. About 10 other visitors were clustered together at the edge, looking anxiously toward the sea in Shinagawa, whispering nervously amongst themselves. But my brother was standing apart from them, alone, his binoculars fixed on the grounds of a Sakusa shrine, scanning it intently. From behind, he looked striking in his velvet suit, standing out vividly against the pale, heavy clouds, with none of the clutter below in sight. Even though I knew it was him, he looked like a figure from a Western oil painting, almost majestic, and I felt hesitant to disturb him. But remembering what my mother had asked of me, I gathered my resolve and approached him from behind. "What are you looking at, brother?" I asked. He jumped slightly, turning around with a flustered look, but said nothing. I pressed on, saying, "Father and Mother are very worried about you. Every day, we wonder where you go, and it seems you've been coming here all this time. Please, tell me what's going on. You've always been close with me? Can't you confide in me alone?" There was no one else near us, so I took advantage of the privacy to plead with him on top of that tower. He was reluctant, but as I continued asking, again and again, he eventually seemed to give in. Finally, he revealed the secret he'd been keeping for the past month. And the cause of his torment, it turned out, was indeed an extraordinary one. My brother explained that about a month earlier, he had come up to the tower and, through these binoculars, had caught a fleeting glimpse of a girl's face in the crowded grounds of Asakusa. He said she was so beautiful, so otherworldly, that even he, who had always been indifferent to women, felt a chilling thrill at the sight of her, so much so that he couldn't stop thinking about her. Shocked by his own reaction, he had lowered the binoculars immediately after seeing her. But when he tried to find her again, feverishly scanning the crowd, he could no longer spot her face. With the binoculars bringing distant things close and the throngs of people below, seeing her once did not mean he could easily find her a second time. After that day, my brother could not forget the beautiful girl he'd glimpsed through the binoculars, and, being an extremely shy man, he began to suffer from what you might call an old-fashioned case of lovesickness. People today might laugh, but back then, it wasn't unusual for a man to fall deeply in love with a woman he'd only seen in passing, and for that love to consume him. My brother, frail and barely able to eat, would drag himself up to the 12-story tower every day, hoping that by some miracle he might catch sight of her again on the grounds of Kannon Temple. That's the strange nature of love, isn't it? Once he confided his feelings to me, he resumed his obsessive binocular gazing like a man fevered. I, feeling a profound sympathy for his plight, didn't have the heart to discourage him, even though it was a futile search. Instead, I could only stand behind him, my eyes filling with tears as I watched his figure. And then, at that moment, I'll never forget the eerie beauty of that scene. Even though it happened over 30 years ago, when I close my eyes, the colors of that dreamlike vision come back to me as vividly as ever. As I stood behind him, I saw nothing but sky, with my brother's slender figure outlined starkly against the shifting clouds. His image floated there, and for a moment, I thought he might actually be suspended in midair. Then, suddenly, as if fireworks had gone off, Countless orbs of red, blue, and purple drifted up into the pale sky, rising lazily one after the other. I know it sounds strange, but it was like a painting or an omen of some kind, and it filled me with an indescribable sense of mystery. When I quickly looked down to investigate, I realized that a balloon vendor had accidentally let loose a batch of rubber balloons. Balloons were much rarer back then, so even after I understood what they were, the sight still left me with a peculiar feeling. Oddly enough, perhaps triggered by that spectacle, my brother suddenly came over to me, breathless and flushed, gripping my hand tightly. "Come on, let's go. Hurry, or we'll miss her," he said, pulling me down the stone steps of the tower. As we descended, I asked him what was going on, and he explained that he'd finally spotted the girl he'd been searching for, sitting on a wide tatami room floor, so there was still time to find her in that same place. He described the location he had in mind: a spacious room behind Kannon Temple, marked by a large pine tree. When we arrived, we found the tree exactly as he'd described, but there wasn't a single building in sight. It felt as though we had been tricked by some spirit. I assumed my brother was mistaken, yet seeing him so utterly despondent, I went around asking at various tea stalls in the area if anyone had seen a girl matching his description, but there was no sign of her anywhere. At some point, my brother and I became separated while searching. After circling back to the pine tree, I found him crouched in front of a peep show booth set up among the various stalls, gazing intently through the viewing lens as he squatted. I tapped him on the shoulder and said, "What are you doing, brother?" He turned around with a start, and I'll never forget the look on his face. It was as if he were in a trance, as though he'd slipped into some dream. His face had slackened, his gaze seemed distant, and even his voice sounded hollow as he told me, "The girl we were looking for is in here." Curious, I paid the fee and looked through the lens myself. It was a peep show of the story of Yaoya Oshichi, just as it reached the scene in the library of Kichiyu Temple, where Oshichi was leaning tenderly against Kichisa. I'll never forget it. The showman and his wife were singing in a raspy, lilting voice, keeping time with a whip. As they chanted, she leans in close with her knee and sends a signal with her gaze. I can still hear that strange refrain. She leans in close with her knee and sends a signal with her gaze. It echoes in my memory to this day. The figures in the peep show were crafted in raised fabric by a master of the art, no doubt. Oshichi's face was so vivid and lifelike that even to my eyes, she seemed truly alive. So it's no wonder my brother spoke the way he did. He said, "Even if I know that she is merely a crafted figure, I can't give her up. It's tragic, but I can't let go. If only, even just once, I could become like Kichisa in the artwork and speak to her." He stood there, gazing at her, unable to move. Thinking back on it, that peep show frame was open at the top to let in light, so it must have been visible even from the top of the 12-story tower. By then, dusk was setting in, and the crowd had thinned to only a few lingering children with bobbed haircuts, loitering by the peep show stall, reluctant to leave. The sky, which had been cloudy since midday, was growing even darker and heavier, like it might rain at any moment, creating an oppressive atmosphere that made me feel as though I might lose my sanity. There was a faint, drum-like rumbling in the background, adding to the eerie tension. My brother stood there, staring into the distance, unmoving for what felt like an hour. Eventually, night fully fell, and distant lights from the fair began to glow, flickering in the dark. Then, suddenly, my brother snapped out of his daze. He grabbed my arm and said, "I've thought of something. Please, I beg you, look at me through this telescope, but hold it upside down, with the large lens toward your eye." Puzzled, I asked why, but he wouldn't give an answer. He simply insisted, so I had no choice but to comply. Now, I've never been fond of telescopes or microscopes. I find the way distant objects suddenly appear close, or tiny creatures grow enormous, quite unsettling. That's why, although my brother prized this telescope, I'd rarely looked through it. That evening, in the dim, secluded area behind Kannon Temple, the thought of holding the telescope upside down to peer at my brother seemed utterly absurd. Yet I did as he asked. Through the reversed lens, my brother, who stood several meters away, appeared shrunken, no more than 2 feet tall, yet in the darkness, he stood out in sharp focus. It must have been at that moment that he began to back away, for he grew smaller with each second until he looked like a tiny doll, barely a foot tall. Then, as if he were floating, he faded into the darkness, vanishing before my eyes. Terrified, I dropped the telescope and shouted, "Brother," and ran toward the spot where he had disappeared, but no matter how much I searched, he was nowhere to be found. Given the time that had passed, he couldn't have gone far, yet he was simply gone. And so, my brother vanished from this world entirely. Ever since, I have dreaded telescopes, fearing them as if they held some dark magic. Especially this one, which I believe was once owned by a foreign ship captain. I'm convinced that, whatever happens, I must never look through it upside down. A terrible fate awaits those who do, which is why I panicked earlier when I saw you holding it that way. Later that night, worn out from searching, I found myself back at the peep show stall. And that's when a thought struck me. Perhaps, I realized, my brother's love for that crafted figure was so intense that he used the enchanted power of the telescope to shrink himself, slipping quietly into her world. I begged the peep show operator, who had not yet packed up, to let me view the scene at Kichijoji Temple one last time. And there, just as I feared, my brother had become part of the artwork. In the light of the oil lantern, he had replaced Kichisa, smiling blissfully as he embraced Oshichi. But you know, I didn't feel sad. On the contrary, I felt a deep happiness, almost to the point of tears, for my brother who had found such joy in fulfilling his heartfelt wish. I made a firm promise to the peep show operator to buy the artwork, no matter the cost. Oddly, The operator didn't seem to notice that my brother, dressed in his Western suit, had replaced the character of Kichisa in the scene. I rushed home and told my mother everything, every detail, but neither my father nor my mother would take me seriously. They thought I'd lost my mind. Isn't that funny? The old man laughed, as if the whole thing were a tremendous joke, and strangely enough, I found myself laughing along with him. They were convinced that people couldn't turn into crafted figures. But doesn't my brother's disappearance prove otherwise? He vanished from this world without a trace, yet they still insist he must have run away. Isn't that absurd? In the end, despite what anyone said, I begged my mother for the money, bought that peep show artwork, and took it with me on a journey from Hakone, Pamakura. I wanted to take my brother and his beloved on a honeymoon, you see. Riding the train like this brings back those memories. Just like today, I would set the picture by the window so my brother and his love could see the sights. I'm sure it made him so very happy. And as for the girl, how could she reject the depth of his devotion? The two of them, like newlyweds, would blush with delight, brushing against each other and exchanging sweet nothings, full of affection. Later, our father closed up the business in Tokyo and moved back to his hometown near Toyama, and I went with him. It's been over 30 years since then. That's why, now, I thought I'd bring my brother to see Tokyo once more, which has changed so much. And so, we're traveling together, just like this. But you know, he said, with a touch of sorrow in his voice, while the girl remains forever young and beautiful, crafted as she is, my brother, though preserved as a crafted figure, continues to age like any mortal. See, once a beautiful young man of 25, he's now covered in wrinkles, his hair turned completely white. It must be terribly sad for him. While his beloved remains youthful, he alone grows old and worn. It's a cruel fate. From a few years ago, he started to wear that pained expression, as if in endless suffering. When I think of it, my heart aches terribly for him. The old man looked at the elderly figure in the artwork, his face clouded in sorrow. Then, as if realizing he had gone on for too long, he said, I've told quite the story, haven't I? But you understand, don't you? You don't think I'm mad, as others do you? It's nice to finally share this with someone who understands. My brother must be tired too, as well as his beloved, having to sit through all this in front of you. I'll let them rest now. With that, he carefully wrapped the frame in the black cloth. At that moment, I thought I saw something. A slight shift in the expressions of the crafted figures. A faint, bashful smile at the corner of their lips, almost as if they were acknowledging me. The old man fell silent, and so did I. The train continued to rumble, its dull sounds carrying us through the darkness. After about 10 minutes, the train began to slow, and a few scattered lights appeared outside the window as we pulled into a small mountain station. There was only one station attendant, standing alone on the platform. Well, I'll be off here. I'm staying overnight with some relatives, the old man said, hugging the wrapped frame to his chest as he rose. He left with a final farewell, and as I watched through the window, I saw his slender figure, uncannily like the elderly man in the crafted artwork, hand his ticket to the attendant at the simple fence, then quietly disappear into the darkness beyond.